Hey everybody, welcome to Wandering DMs. I am Dan, and today my partner Paul is off wandering, and so hopefully we'll get a report from him real soon. But it's a really big day because I'm joined by two very special guests. I've got Greg Svenson and Daniel Boggs to talk about their book, The Lost Dungeons of Tonisborg, and what a book it is. Greg and Dan, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yep.
We are as some of our viewers know, Paul normally runs the technical stuff, so I am managing that today. And if there's any glitches that you're seeing, it's entirely due to me. I think Daniel has a very fancy background behind him that we'll enjoy while he's on the show today. Other thing is, if the chat starts going really fast today and you're on YouTube, do remember we do have Super Chat on. So if you want a question that I missed, feel free to use the super chat, and we'll be sure to get that question to Greg and or Dan. So, little introduction. If there's any viewers that don't know, of course, Greg is the Great Svenny, and he's one of the very first ever fantasy role players because he played with Dave Arneson as DM. And Daniel is one of our most renowned D&D archaeologists, and between them, they've rediscovered Greg's mega dungeon design from 1973. Which is actually before D&D was published, to be clear. After that was actually lost for about 40 years, and you guys have made it available for us today. It's a beautiful, beautiful book. So the first question that one of our longtime viewers queued up, Stephen Wendell, asked on Facebook, is he really wanted you guys to tell us the story about how you guys rediscovered. How is it possible to lose a dungeon for almost 40 years and then rediscover it? How did that happen?
You want to lead this, Dan?
Greg, do you want to start with at least how it was lost?
Yeah, it was lost.
Yeah.
Yeah. Of course, I developed it in '73, and it turned out Dave McGarry made a photocopy of it before he moved to Boston, and he put it in a box and stuck it in his attic, and forgot about it. And we were both living in Boston in 1980, and he asked if he could borrow it to make a photocopy of it. And he was working at a copy center at Harvard University, and he took it home. He worked third shift, so he put it in a magazine to keep from crumpling the pages, and went to sleep. And when he woke up the next morning, or actually that evening, to go to work, the magazine was gone. And it turned out the cleaning lady had tossed it in the trash. So that's how it disappeared. And
wow.
Dan,
so how did
you want to take over?
That's heartbreaking.
I was a little disappointed, yes. A lot disappointed. Well, anyway, we're still friends.
So I knew this story for a long time because Greg had mentioned it on some of the forums, and I always hoped, well, maybe something would turn up. And when I started working with Griffith Morgan as a researcher for his documentary Secrets of Blackmoor, he prompted a lot of the Twin Cities guys to dig through a lot of old papers, including Dave McGarry. And I was talking to Mr. McGarry about other things, and he had sent me some papers, and he said, I've got these other dungeons. I'm not sure. I think one of these is mine, and then there's this other thing that he just labeled Dungeon Unknown. And I looked at that, and when I first saw the file, I was like, wow, this looks like Blackmoor. But then digging into it a little bit more, it's like, well, this doesn't match anything in Blackmoor Dungeon. I wonder if it could be Tonisborg, because that was the other, early dungeon we knew about. So I sent copies of the scans to Greg, and I said, do you recognize any of this? And he emailed back right away and said, yeah, that's my handwriting. That's my Lost Tonisborg. So, yeah. Yeah, so it turns out that whoever it was, someone made a photocopy that David McGarry had back in probably 1974 when he first went to Boston. And he may have taken that with him and then packed it up when he moved back. He moved back and forth to Boston a couple of times. And that box of stuff that he had got, as Greg said, put in an attic or a basement or whatever and forgotten about. And so it was photocopies of Greg's original. And it had the one is that David McGarry had colored certain sections with marker to indicate things that meant something to him. But really, it just differentiated the different sections. So it has both some of David's notes on it and some of Greg's original notes, which are really interesting because it tells us about when he first made it, what he was thinking of in terms of what was where and how it was stocked. So
yeah, I have on screen. I grabbed a screenshot that our friend Griff Morgan made available on the Secrets of Blackmoor site up the top of the screen right at the moment, and it says there, courtesy Dave McGarry, copyright Dave McGarry there, and I think the green sections were the sections you mentioned that he colored. I think probably for secret areas, I think is what you decoded later on, and so of course Griff made the that's what that is.
It's separate areas that are usually separated by secret doors, and there's secret doors all over the place. And this was before there was a convention of putting a little box with an S in it, or so you had to know. It's like when you look at the Blackmoor dungeon maps, you have to know what the conventions are because they're very different from what we became familiar with TSR maps.
Understood. Yeah, particularly for me, so our friend Griff sent the book over here, and you three guys obviously worked on it. So it's Greg's original dungeon design, and I got to say, I am so delighted that you guys made the decision to actually reproduce Greg's original hand-drawn dungeon, because I think for many years people making products shied away from that, like they felt they need to have a polished product. But for me, I find it completely invaluable to see Greg's original design there. And then you've got an expanded version that you wrote, Dan. You have like a theory of old school design section that Griff wrote, I guess. And then you also have a complete rule set, a complete original D&D style rule set that you've put together, Dan, that you call the Zero Edition Dungeoneering rules. So the whole thing here is like a complete game system all in one book. You just grab dice and you have a total game system, and you have a complete mega dungeon designed by Greg, and you can run a whole. It's like a great gift for new players, frankly, because it's a whole game plus campaign all in one book, which is really fascinating.
I had insisted that the originals be in there somewhere. I've been poring over that, Greg, and I am so glad to have seen it. So let me say a couple things about this. And I got into D&D, a couple of years later than you did, obviously, right? And I'm kind of in the unusual situation where I learned entirely from the book. I was in a very rural area. Nobody else had ever heard of the game. I got the Eric Holmes basic set that I asked for Christmas, like along about 1979 or so. And so not having a mentor, not having someone who showed me how to play the game live, I was the one that read the book, interpreted it, and taught everybody in my hometown about it. So as someone that considers him an old school DM, I certainly have never played with such minimalist notes. And so your notes here are, you have the dungeon design, and then your notes are generally just monster, treasure on one line, the end. And I'm personally just fascinated how someone would run a game with such minimalist notes. What would, if you or Dave were running this, like how much improvising would you make around those? Would you be always improvising like elaborate furnishings around that stuff, or what would you be doing? I would, yes. Yeah. Where I thought it made sense, I would describe there could be puddles, there could be moss on the wall, there could be interesting smells.
What was there? Was there any such thing as an empty room? Like, was there any room that the players would walk into and you just say, "Well, this room, as far as you can tell, totally empty"? Would that ever happen for you, Greg?
It did in Dave's dungeon, and I didn't really probably understand how to stock it. I rolled for every room, and okay, that's what I've got. And then, of course, the monsters could be wandering instead of there, so they weren't always home.
Interesting. Well, that was another question I was going to ask. How important were the wandering monsters? Like, because some people consider old school gaming to be like a really tense, like you're about to get ambushed every single second by a wandering monster. Was it that common for you, or wandering monsters less common?
They were not that common. No, not continuous. They were around, but you weren't running into them all the time. Got it.
And when they showed up, were you drawing from like a nearby room for what they were, or did you have a separate table for what showed up?
I was drawing from nearby rooms, or if you're at the very bottom of the dungeon, I had my super monster down there, Yelleth. So,
tell us about that. Actually, so you have an interesting custom monster there. Where did the inspiration for that come from?
It came from a science fiction book. The creature was on a spaceship, if I remember correctly, and I just plugged it in the lower levels. And to be honest, when this came up, I hadn't thought about it in 40 years, and I didn't remember how I managed it.
That's pretty funny. So Dan, with your archaeology with the Z rules that are baked in here, and you looked at original D&D, and you've looked at pre-D&D drafts, kind of like Greg was working on when he made the design, plus commentary that we have from Arneson and Gygax later on. I noticed that you've got wandering monster rules in there that have a much lower frequency than we're accustomed to, like in the normal book. So in your Z rules, it says once in a while roll 2 dice, and if you get a total of 2, then a wandering monster shows up. Is that where did that interpretation come from? I'm wondering.
So put me on the spot, but I know that there's a very similar rule. This is probably what I was drawing from in DNA DOA by Arneson, where he has wandering monsters show up at intersections, and you roll 2 dice, and I think it was a 6 in that case. If you get a 6, then you get a wandering monster at every intersection. So I'm pretty sure that the thing about the Z rules is I really looked at things that Arneson said and things that Gary said, and that they did. As you know, Gary Gygax ran a couple of online games and put out his house rules for OD&D. So that was one source to look at, and also things that like DNA DOA from Arneson and other books that he had done, where he put out little rules. Okay, that's an interesting idea from the guys who created the game in the first place. So I'll just weave that into the rules. I wouldn't put anything in there that came from anybody else or from me, if I can help it. I was trying to stay true to the original two designers. So, and another point to the wandering monsters I might make is that, similar to what Greg is saying, if you look at in supplement 2, the Temple of the Frog on levels there, Arneson has it that the denizens of various rooms usually will give a percentage of they're in this room 60% of the time, and the rest of the time they might be wandering the halls or so on and so forth. So it was likely the usual way they handled wandering monsters, just as Greg was saying. drawing
Nice,
from the
nice.
from the environment. Yeah.
And it's also he does kind of the same thing in his in Dave's first fantasy campaign. He kind of says the same thing for wilderness adventuring, is basically pretty similar methodology too.
Yeah.
Obviously, we for some reason we're really focused. Like Paul and I are really focused on how important are wandering monsters, because obviously we named our channel Wandering DMs after that, so it's always on our mind. We felt that we had to ask about that specifically.
Sure.
So our viewer John Miller has a question that I was going to ask anyway, because I was really interested in it. Is that the design for Tonisborg certainly feels very similar, very close to Blackmoor. And if I can pull up, because I have, there it is. So in the top right of the screen right now, I've got right page from Dave's first fantasy campaign, and those are the first 2 levels of the Blackmoor dungeon. So level 1 on the right, level 2 on the left. And among the things that are interesting is they're a little sparse, like Gygax's original dungeons use up the whole page. Like every single square was a room or hallway for like the top level of his Greyhawk dungeon. These are a little bit more sparse. You have kind of thin tunnels running around, and there's a lot of diagonals. Which usually makes like player mappers very unhappy. If I'm running a D&D session, I go, now this is going northwest. The mapper is groans and shakes their head like, oh God, here we are with this. There's a lot of diagonal elements and kind of oddball shaped rooms around. And then if I go back to the picture of the Tonisborg dungeon here, right there. Right, so there's the hand version of Greg's. Again, a lot of diagonal elements. And the other thing, Greg, is you have lots and lots of up and down vertical elements. You've got stairs going down 3 or 4 levels, and you have pits and fire shafts. And the entry stairs don't even go to the first level. The entry stairs go to level 2 instead, which I thought was really clever. And at some point, I think Griff counted like 33 up and down elements just on a single level. Why so many diagonal elements, and why so many up-down elements?
I can't really explain it, except that Dave Arneson and I sat down, and I had tried to do a dungeon earlier, but I had just taken a maze book and opened up one of the pages, picked one of the pages, and I created my first dungeon on that. And then when John Snyder led a group in and made every right turn to get right to the main treasure place, I said, oh, this isn't going to work. So I started over to design an actual dungeon, and Dave actually was looking at publishing here's how to design a dungeon. And he gave me I think it was about a 2-page instructions on how to do it. And I did it all randomly. I rolled dice for every curve, every stairs. I rolled dice to determine how far they went up and down. So it was totally randomly generated.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
At some point I kind of wanted to ask that, and I kind of didn't dare, honestly. I'm so glad you said that. That's fascinating.
Mm-hmm. If you look at if you look at levels 1 to 6, there's more connections in those because you're using a 6-sided die, and then it kind of starts over again. So
brilliant. Is there any chance that you have
that's what Griff says? I haven't actually checked that, but that's what Griff had said. Yeah.
Okay. Got it. Have you ever in our viewer Stephen Wendell is reminding us that there was a solo random dungeon generation that appeared in the first issue of the Strategic Review. I think in 1975, and then that was basically and then it was basically republished in the first edition DM's Guide, which a lot of people know of. Was that a progenitor of what Greg was using, or totally unrelated, do you think?
It's completely unrelated.
Yeah, I have no idea.
Have you guys found that document? Have you guys found that the 2 pages that Dave told you how to make a dungeon with? Does that exist?
I don't think it exists anymore. If it does, it's in Arneson's library. Not it would be in his daughter's house probably.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any chance that Dave McGarry made a photocopy and it's somewhere in his files?
I wouldn't have given it to him. I think I returned it to Dave.
So the closest thing may be that if you look at the Loch Lomond material in the first fantasy campaign, there's a mention of generating tunnels and a die roll for that. But it doesn't have, it doesn't deal with stairs or anything like that. So that's the, and there's a level of complexity to both, certainly to Blackmoor and to Tonisborg that goes beyond any random rolls. So I think that the instructions would have been more of guidelines rather than, here's a bunch of tables and you roll on those. I think it's more along the lines of, okay, at the end of the corridor, roll to see if you have a stair that goes down 3 levels, or roll to see how deep your stair is. And then connect things up that way, because there's no way you could generate, well, maybe if you had a very complex computer program, the sort of connections that you get with Tonisborg from level to level to level to level, or with Blackmoor Dungeon, which is about twice the size, really. They're
Right.
extremely complex vertical mazes of the sort that, to be honest, I don't know of any dungeon that's been made to date that is as complex. It's like finding a Rolex in a stone. They're really amazing the way that they are put together. So
it's funny, Dan, that you mention a computer program, because as an ex-computer game programmer, and that's how me and my co-host Paul met. At one point, I did I myself made a 3D maze generator, and it did actually have all these unitary up to one room, over down 5 levels, and there's 3 rooms, and it's disconnected from the rest of the level. And I never ran a game with it because I felt like, this is far too complicated and the players are going to be really angry at me. And I actually shied away from that. And then when I looked at Greg's Tonisborg, I was like, this kind of echoes and has that feel of those components, which I personally like myself, but I think maybe speaks to the level of expertise of the players that Greg was playing with. Because I actually at one point didn't dare throw something like that at my players.
Right. It's also about the purpose of the game, or the way that play was being designed around the idea of exploration as a integral component of the game. You're going down in this deep hole, and what's around the corner, and how do I get from here to there? With all the secret doors and up and down passages and so on and so forth. So it was an exploration-focused game.
And I was
as part of the fun.
In enough dungeon expeditions in Blackmoor that I had most of it memorized.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I couldn't do it. I couldn't do anything near that now. I mean, I probably couldn't find my way into the first level, but 50 years ago, I had it memorized. That we didn't make maps.
I sympathize with that. You didn't make maps. Did I catch that right?
Not after the first few games, because I knew where we were.
Wow.
And I remembered,
Amazing.
and I could tell people how to get out from wherever they were.
Wow.
I couldn't do that now. I couldn't have done it 5 years afterwards, even.
So
I hear that.
Greg, you could speak to this, but it's my understanding that Arneson would draw little sketches of the rooms in order to help.
That would happen, yeah.
With the verbal description,
yeah. Or actually, on the first dungeon expedition, he actually took us into the laundry room in his house and had us line up in our marching order, and then turned off the lights and did some screaming, and then looked at what we did and where we went, and that was our moves.
It's interesting to think about this early moment of like pure experimentation of, I think I tried something like that once myself, and then it was like not all the players are happy with it. If I get someone who physically themselves can't move super well, that's going to be a little bit unfair. And like I myself tried that like once, and then never did that again myself. So it's really interesting to hear about this moment where we have no idea what this game form is going to turn into at this point. Really, really fascinating like that. Let me ask a couple other questions. Yeah, go ahead.
No, that's fine. I was just going to say that was probably our first encounter.
There you go. That feels like the first. Okay, so on that point, Greg, I guess I have to ask you, and I know you've told this story before. The fact that you were on the first ever dungeon delve that ever existed in a fantasy game, years before D&D came out, and you were also the only survivor. So if it wasn't for you, the very first dungeon game would have been a TPK, as we call it now, a total party kill. How was it that you, Greg, were the only survivor?
It should have been a TPK, but the bad guys, the wizard and the Belrog that were fighting us, decided that they wanted one to escape to tell the story of how terrible it was, so that no one would ever go down there again. And of course, everybody wanted to go down there again, but they wanted to frighten everybody away, and so when I was the only one still standing, they just stopped, and they actually showed me the way out, because at that point I was lost.
Wow. Well, thanks to them, we know about the Blackmoor dungeons, and I would like to emphasize, like, if you were playing D&D for the very first time, and maybe you rolled up first level characters, and you go into a dungeon, and you wind up facing down a wizard with a Balrog, that is a DM that's not pulling their punches. I would say that's pretty close. That's going to be either a TPK or pretty close to that. So Dave was not pulling his punches, it doesn't sound like.
No.
Amazing. I had a question from one of our viewers, Jeffrey. I got this on the original D&D forums, the ODD 74 forums, and this was on my mind too. Is the actual when it was published, the D&D rulebook said that usually most of a level should be empty. Most of the levels should not have monsters or treasures, and I think the focus here again is like on the exploration. Where are the monsters? And the book actually says like only a third of the rooms or less should have monsters in them. Tonisborg mostly has monsters in almost all the rooms. Like, many of the levels, every single room that you've got keyed has got a monster in it. There's just a couple places that don't have monsters. Greg, do you think was that common from like your play with Dave? Do you think that was common for the time that almost every single room had a monster in it?
No, I think I probably misunderstood the playtest dungeon stocking rules and just rolled for everything. So I don't think it was that devious or whatever. Yeah. Got
it. Now, unfortunately, I think that Greg's camera seems to be lot stuck at the moment. Hopefully he'll come back momentarily. We can still hear you, Greg.
Okay. I could try.
Maybe try
it back in.
Yeah. The only thing I might ask, maybe try. I hate to even ask this. Maybe because hit just refresh your browser. Just hit F5, and maybe it'll come back in like a couple seconds.
F5.
Yeah, that usually refreshes a browser. Hopefully I don't lose Greg there. Yeah. Okay. Perfect.
Here. Yeah, it looks
Good job. Yes. Yeah, good job. Thank you for doing that.
Well, so we can talk about the stalking list if you want in Tonisborg, because there's some interesting.
And let's do it. And Dan and I have had conversations in the past about this, so I actually kind of am interested in this. Actually, how was it stalked?
So, there's evidence of two different stalkings, right? So, on the maps themselves, there's little notes, particularly to in a couple other places. There's little notes of something that might be there. In one place, there's a suit of armor. In another place, there's a prisoner in a cell that's listed as heavy foot, I believe, which is a chainmail term. Mm-hmm. And when you look at the stalking list that Greg has on the side of the map, you don't find any of that. So I think when he first made the dungeon in 1973, he's just using the chainmail books, and I don't know if you remember any of this or not, Greg. But then, and I don't know. You weren't using, I can say this for sure, the earliest playtest document to stalk the dungeon, but maybe you had a copy of the pre-print.
I had a copy of chainmail, and I thought I had a copy when I did this of pre. Well, I call it a playtest copy. The pre-D&D
print. Yeah. The reason I say that is because there's a couple of items in the list that don't show up on the earliest draft, but do show up in the print of the original Dungeons and Dragons that are on your list. So you must have had a later preprint copy, or else you got an early print copy of the three books to use, and then followed those.
I didn't get the print copy until the fall of '74, so it was probably not that.
Yeah. So it had to have been an early one. Had to have been, because Dave McGarry had these before that when he went to Boston.
Right.
Yeah. So
some of us can get pretty deep.
Earlier stalking. Yeah.
Right.
And then,
right. Now, like Dan and I can. Dan and I can cite like scholarly references to like 4 or 5 different, preprint developments before D&D got published. But I agree. Clearly, Greg was obviously working from shortly before D&D was going to get created, and the list of the monsters and the treasures and the stalking are clearly from that. One question that I had to both of you is, to your knowledge, that first list that's basically in published D&D, that first list of monsters and list of treasures, to your knowledge, who initially drafted that? Was that Dave or was that Gary, to your knowledge?
I didn't see what Dave sent to Gary, so I don't really know.
Okay. Do you have a guess on that, Dan?
For the dungeon stalking list, I think that Gary drafted that, and I think he was influenced by David McGarry's dungeon.
Right.
The dungeon game. Yeah.
Yeah, the dungeon game for the monsters. Yeah.
The board game. Yeah.
So I'm really not talking so much
how
about
each one had, harder monsters as you go down. That was something that originated with David McGarry.
Yeah. So I'm actually not talking about that. I'm talking about the list of monsters. So like, the very first page in what's volume 2 is, here's the monsters that are going to show up in D&D, and in that same volume, the lettered treasure types, right? That right there. Does that smack you as Dave or Gary's work? I asked the hard questions.
and I have,
Or is
have
that
to say I
still
don't
not known?
I don't know. I don't.
So
I did
what I
have
would
those tables
theorize,
because I remember the letters. Yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
Right.
I think that Gary is elaborating on what David sent him in terms of the treasure types. You see something
Mhm.
almost identical in Arneson's dragon types, which is
Okay.
something that goes back to like 1972. And I think Gary saw that and said, okay, well, we'll just, if dragons have a treasure and they're like this, well, every monster should have one, and we'll just give them all letters. That's what I think happened.
I think that's a pretty good guess. I think I'm sliding in the same direction as you, Dan. I agree that the increasing difficulty of levels, like McGarry's dungeon game, looks like it got written by Gary, and that list of monsters with the lettered treasures looks more like a Dave thing to me. But
Yeah.
I'm very far away, so that's total speculation on my part. But I think that's I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case. Yeah, totally.
But I can say
so
that,
one of our
that Greg, certainly you embrace that in stalking Tonisborg.
Oh yeah.
I can see that. I can see that. Yeah. Yeah, very cool. So on that, one of our viewers is asking the question: when did and a lot of those initial monsters in D&D, there's a lot of Grecian mythology stuff, centaurs and pegasi and griffins and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of Tolkienian stuff. There's elves and dwarves and gnomes and hobbits and stuff, and giant spiders and stuff like that. And then among like the very first novelty custom things in D&D are the whole list of slime monsters. Green slime, yellow mold, gray ooze, ochre jelly, black pudding, stuff like that. So the Tonisborg dungeon has yellow mold, it's got black pudding, it's got that stuff. And our viewer, Perkins Dearborn, was asking, who first got hit by green slime, basically? Was that part of the Blackmoor dungeons? Or did that show up later?
I don't know who did that, but I know that the black pudding was the monster where we got put in that hallway in the basement, the laundry room at Dave Arneson's on that first adventure, and that monster was based on a Japanese sci-fi movie, The Blob. For what that's worth.
So you're telling me the very first monster you ran into was a black pudding? Is that am I hearing right?
Yes. Yes. And which way we ran was determining whether we ran into it or didn't.
Because I got to say to viewers, if you don't know, the black pudding is one of the most horrible monsters in original D&D. Initially, the hit dice of monsters only went up to 10, and the black pudding has the maximum number of hit dice. So right out of the bag, Greg got hit by the single worst monster in the book for the first room, which is like just stunning. That's amazing. Amazing. Wow. I think that because there's a dungeon by Bill Webb, and all of a sudden the name's escaping me, even though I played it a bunch of times. It similarly has like a horrible black pudding, like on the first level. And spoiler alert, but I think that's probably inspired by that story, probably.
Could be
really fascinating. Okay, now here's a question. So in the core books, it basically explicitly says to scale the number of monsters to how many players are present. So you bring twice as many players tonight. Now you're going to be confronting twice as many monsters. The monster lists that I see in Tonisborg, the area lists, and also in Blackmoor are a fixed number. When you would play, Greg, were you scaling the number of monsters to how many players showed up, or were you not doing that?
Not at all.
Interesting.
I was not. It never.
So did you ever feel it was too easy? Like if a whole bunch of players brought their friends, did you ever feel it was too easy, or did you not worry about that?
I didn't worry about it, but we were I don't think I did more than 4 or 5 people. So, how many could you fit in our living room?
Interesting.
our apartment living room. No, I didn't do any scaling. So
interesting. Really, that's really interesting to me, because some people would be, some people would be very vehement that has to be part of early gaming. So I personally like hearing the different approaches like that. A part of the theory part of the Tonisborg book that I think Griff wrote is, highly recommends bringing henchmen, right? Going and hiring non-player characters. How big a part of your early gaming, Greg, was bringing a bunch of NPC henchmen that you'd hired? Did that happen a lot?
we did do that, yes. That first adventure, there were 30 men, but there were only 6 players in the main party that went down. The Great Svenny hired henchmen regularly. Now, sometimes it was just the players, but other times we took our little armies with us. They're all funkies.
Was that consistent? I mean, did you continue to have like 30 characters with you for the years that you were playing, or did that ramp down?
No, it was usually just the guys. We weren't, or you may have one with you, someone helping or carrying your stuff, or there weren't.
What do you feel?
There weren't armies going down in the dungeon, definitely on a normal basis.
Got it. And I remember Dave McGarry telling me that his first experience was like one character and 40 or 50 soldiers with him or something like that. What made that decision? Like, what do you think triggered the decision about whether you're going to bring an army or not?
The person had to have the money to hire him. which at the start was a challenge.
That's great. That's great. The other thing I noticed in the book was the part that Griff wrote says that I guess when he was playing through Tonisborg, he was regularly having a player loss rate, like a kill rate of like 10 or 20% of any particular expedition. The PCs were getting killed. Was that true for original play? Was it like, were you slicing off 1 out of 5 characters every expedition, or was it more or less than that, do you think?
I don't remember, to be honest. I know there were some individuals who had a problem dying regularly, but
I know the type. The type. Yep.
But that wasn't everybody. Some people had a style of, I don't know, kamikaze. Charge in every time without thinking about what the best strategy is, what the best tactics are to get by the way.
I think some of us call that the Leroy Jenkins approach now. I think that's an internet meme, I believe. It's a fairly dated internet meme, but that's the one I know.
My son uses
I know
that.
the type. There you go. Yeah, when I play, I know some players are super aggressive and they don't mind rolling up new characters, and some players are very strategic and they've had long running characters. So I very much know the type. How fast did it? See, I'm a numbers guy, just to be clear. So I ask all these, like, as Dan would expect, I'm going to ask all these detailed questions about percentages and rates and all that kind of thing. Generally speaking, how fast did like Dan's Z rules outlines what to me is a very novel way of awarding experience. I get, based on, I guess, our understanding of what Dave did, it's very different than what the core D&D books say to do. So I'm wondering how fast, in your experience, Greg, characters would level up. Would it take, 3 adventures or 6 adventures or 20 adventures per each level? Or about how fast would people advance through the D&D level system?
Well, when we first started Blackmoor, you're talking Blackmoor, I assume. This is back in
Yeah.
71. We had flunky, hero, and superhero, and you just had wizard,
Mhm.
elf, and dwarf. There were only really levels for the fighters, and I mean, Bill Heaton went from a flunky. We all started as flunkies when we started that first adventure, and he became a hero when he was the first one who could pick up the magic sword that we found. He became everybody's hero and was elevated to the hero status. And my character coming out of the dungeon became a hero at that point. And it was probably 5 or 6 months later when I became a superhero. I don't remember, to be honest, but at some point, and that was just Dave Arneson saying, you're a superhero now. Okay.
Interesting. So you weren't like adding up like 10,712 experience points from day to day. That wasn't part of the play at that time.
No,
Interesting.
That wasn't part of the play at that point. Dave could have been doing it in the background because he had our character sheets initially. We didn't have our own, and it was an index card. So he could have been keeping track of that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, that
Greg, if you remember your
go ahead,
your second edition chainmail, you had some notes in the back of that.
Mm-hmm. I do. I know I have it.
You had it. Yeah. So and of course, second edition came out a little later. So this was, it had developed to the point where Arneson had, I think it was 1,000. You had to get 1,000 points to level to go from flunky to hero, as I recall. And that was, the points are basically the hit points of the monsters, and so he was probably
in
he was probably tallying all that. Yeah.
He probably was. Okay. Yeah.
Interesting. And for people that don't know, there are some of these terms that us old schoolers know. When D&D came out, hero was the title for 4th level fighters, and superhero was the title for 8th level fighters. So there was a lot more granularity inserted in the system versus what Dave Arneson was doing initially. So that's when you say hero, I hear 4th level, and when I hear superhero, I hear 8th level.
Yeah.
Right.
It's me. So
that's right. Except that I think there's pretty good evidence that you could be a hero. Your hero, you have 4 dice, but you could also be a hero with 6 dice, for example. So I think that there was intermediary stages, but they weren't called levels.
Interesting.
Terms hadn't come up yet.
Right. Well, of course, and then once they hit level, they just use it for everything. So the spells, the dungeons, the characters, the monsters, everything was leveled at that point.
Right.
Fascinating. I'm gonna have to keep an eye on the time here to kind of respect it. I could talk to you guys all day long about a bunch of stuff. I'm gonna ask one other detailed, hard question, just because I want to hear it. Is in your mind, Greg, or for the early play, if you had a hero fighting another hero and they both have a sword, one round, or whatever we want to call it, one round of combat, does that represent like one swing per side, or does it represent like a whole bunch of parrying and flurry and steps and back and forth, and maybe one of the many blows gets in? Is it like literally one blow of the weapon, or is it like a whole bunch?
I haven't thought about this in ages. I'm so used to now it's 10 seconds or whatever, or 6 seconds, that I don't think in those terms anymore. At the time, I probably thought of it as one swipe with my sword.
Or
one
chop.
attempt. Or one chop, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I see, in Dave's writings. He says one chop a lot or one blow. That's fascinating. Either way, whatever the answer was going to be, that was going to be fascinating. Really good. So if you're accustomed to 6-second, 10-second rounds, do you play currently, Greg? What kind of rules do you use when you play most recently?
I'm in a play-by-post game online in Discord that I've been in for 17 years at this point, with different characters over time. It's become generational, I guess. And we're using the 3.5 rules most of the time. We've done some OD&D as well. So that's the thing I'm most familiar with, is the 3.5 rules.
Fascinating. The people you play with, is there people from the old Twin Cities days, or is it a whole new bunch of people that you're interacting with?
It's a bunch of different people. They're all over the world. Raphael's the dungeon master, and he's in Germany. Raphael San Miguel de Turin. Harvard, you've heard of Harvard. He's been part of it in the past. Other guys, some are here, some are in Europe.
Wow. That sounds great. That sounds amazing. So we are. That's great to hear. That's great to hear. So every single one of your answers makes me want to ask 5 more questions. So to be respectful of everybody's time, and of course, many of us are going to be part of participating in a big game today. Maybe D&D, maybe not. But I got to thank you guys so much for being on. It's such a nice book, and so again, Greg, it's Greg's original design. Dan has his Zed rules in here. So if you want to give it to a brand new player, just give them dice and shake, and you'll have a whole campaign here right out of the book. Our friend Griff Morgan again sent this over, and he's got the kind of the theory part in here. It's just a wonderful production, great. Update to the maps by, I think, Toby Lancaster. They look great. And the fact that this came out right last year was the 50th anniversary of this first ever dungeon game that Dave Arneson ran in Blackmoor. So the fact that this is available now, 50 years after Greg started playing with Dave, I think is just really marvelous. And having the exact reproductions of Greg's hand notes is totally invaluable, and I really can't thank you guys enough for putting that product out. It is so the first printing was in the past, but you can still order a second printing of the same book. If you're on YouTube, I have a link there to go to the site that you can order second printing right now that they're taking orders for, and it is really, really freaking beautiful. Do you guys have any last thoughts about stuff that we didn't mention about the Tonisborg book that you want people to know about?
I would just say that even if you're, we wrote the book in such a way to appeal to everyone from new players to very experienced. You don't have to know anything about traditional gaming, or you don't have to know any of the history. We cover a lot of that, and our goal really is to introduce you to a new style or a new way of thinking about the games based on the way it all started out. And you can take this, you can take the maps, you can do whatever you want to with it. There's endless possibilities of fun there. And hopefully it's a book for the ages that people will find both enjoyable and educational forever. So that's my thoughts.
Yeah,
I think you hit that goal. I think that's super well put. Go ahead, Greg.
I'm personally just very happy to actually see it again, to be honest.
It's a really delightful work, and Greg, for many of us, frankly for decades, right, we kept hearing that we were going to get a full version of Gary Gygax's Greyhawk Dungeon, and we frankly never did. And we kept hearing that we were going to get a full-blown version of Dave Arneson's Blackmoor product. And we saw it in First Fantasy Campaign, but we never really got a full product. So frankly, you giving us an actual mega dungeon from the early years in the actual form that you actually wrote it and playing with is completely invaluable. And as someone that's been waiting for that for like 40 years, I just can't thank you guys enough for that. Really tremendous.
That makes me happy.
So that's going to wrap it up for us here on Wandering DMs this week. If you have any other thoughts that you'd like to share with us, leave it in a comment on YouTube, and we would really look forward to seeing that. Remember that you can like, follow, and subscribe to us, the Wandering DMs, on YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, Facebook, GitHub, and also TikTok. We have the handle Wandering DMs on all of those sites. We also have podcast versions. So if you have a friend that only listens to podcasts, this show will be available on our website, wanderingdms.com, and basically any top podcast provider. You can get our shows there as well. Big thanks to our patrons who support the show. If you want to join them, please visit patreon.com/wanderingdms. A couple different tiers. We have after party chat, for example, on our Discord server about 10 minutes after this show ends every week. So if you are a patron, we'll look forward to continuing the conversation over there. Upcoming shows on Wandering DMs. Paul will be back with another episode of TDR tomorrow, Monday night. I will be back with more gaming, computer gaming from the Elder Times late Thursday night. So look for us there. Enormous thanks to Greg and Dan. Hope I can get you guys back sometime for another batch of questions. Maybe that's a possibility. But nonetheless, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. You're welcome.
Great to be here.
Awesome. Don't forget, the Wandering DMs are live every Sunday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. 2 weeks from today, look for a guest appearance by Mr. Luke Gygax, going to tell us about the plans for GaryCon this year. So that should be in about 2 weeks. Follow us on the socials. You'll get updates about that. But please join us again next week for another thought-provoking discussion.